As I mentioned, according to House Coronavirus Subcommittee Chairman Brad Winstrup and House Intelligence Committee Chairman Mike Turner, a senior-level CIA officer with decades of experience testified to members of Congress that the CIA offered a monetary bribe to agents investigating the origins of COVID-19 to change their conclusion that the virus originated from a leak at the Wuhan Lab. Now, you'll recall that both the FBI and the Department of Energy released their conclusions that the virus most likely originated from the Wuhan Lab. So what was behind this? Why would the CIA want to cover up their own findings? What were they afraid of? Who were they trying to protect? Where does this go back to? Joining me now to discuss this and more is Congressman Rich McCormick. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, as well as the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. He represents the 6th Congressional District of Georgia. Dr. McCormick, welcome back to the program. Great to see you.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
So what do we know about this potential CIA bribe and cover-up so far?
Yeah, so what we've heard is some of it's not specific, but basically 6 out of 7 scientists originally stated that they thought that this was from a lab leak. And it makes sense. As a scientist, as an ER doctor, not much else makes sense other than a lab leak. Then suddenly they changed their opinions based on essentially a bribe. They were promised a bonus if they would reconsider and say, no, we think this came from a natural, of course, such as a bat or a dog or whatever you want to say it came from. The fact of the matter is it never made sense from the beginning because China put a considerable amount of effort into proving that it came from a natural source, which they could never prove. If it came from a natural reservoir, then it would have still existed. That's how viruses exist. They continue in the same species, but we've never been able to identify that whatsoever. So the only remaining natural theory that makes sense is from the lab leak, from a lab that, by the way, remember, said we were going to do we want to get funding for this advancement of technology so we can actually have gain of function. We said no. They did it anyways. Usually when you ask for that kind of funding, they've already started anyways.
Right.
It was embarrassing to our government. In my opinion, Fauci covered it up because he was embarrassed that we're funding it to begin with, even if it was with or without our permission. Why the CIA got involved with it would have to have been some sort of direction from the president. Otherwise, I don't know why they'd want to cover it up, quite frankly. And that's what we got to get to the bottom of, is the next step of why there was such a cover-up. Why would the CIA get involved in pushing their thumb down on the scales of justice and figuring out what actually happened? That's what's really worrying people all the way around. When the government comes in and they have an issue that has nothing to do with getting what's right and just, not finding the truth, but just playing politics, that always worries us. From the beginning of time, from the establishment of our country, we've had a deep mistrust of government, and especially when they do these sort of things, it just makes us more worried.
Well, being on the subcommittee, the select subcommittee on the coronavirus, you've heard a lot of testimony, look at a lot of documents. Is it reasonable to look at this and say, was the CIA possibly covering for China?
It sure is troubling to think that. I mean, why would they? I think it's because we have been in coercion unwittingly. I think it makes us look very dull in our investment in the Wuhan Lab. Where they did something that literally cost multiple countries millions and millions of lives of their citizens because something that we're funding. Like I said, I don't think we wittingly went into this and said, we want you to do gain of function. We're authorizing that. But the fact is, we were funding it, whether we wanted to or not. And I think that's where the cover-up came. And as you know, most problems come from cover-ups, not from honesty.
Right. So what are the next steps for the subcommittee that's looking into this now that you have this information?
Well, let's find out who got those bonuses. Identify those scientists, bring them in, make them testify so they actually have to have an honest conversation and enlighten us on who gave those bonuses, who offered it. Specifically, let's weed out the CIA. Let's weed out the FBI. Let's make sure we call to the carpet those people who are doing things that are not just unjust, but dishonest, and get an honest conversation. I think that's what the American public demands, is that they have transparency of their government, that their government agencies aren't colluding with the enemy or covering up something that we can learn from, because we want better answers for the things that we fund.
But it's kind of like whack-a-mole. I mean, every time you turn around, there's another scandal over here. There's more information coming out over here. And in fact, you've been heavily focused on the chaos at the southern border, particularly as an entry point for known terrorists. What is the way forward here? What does the Biden administration need to do to address the crisis at our border?
The only thing the Biden administration can do to address the border is to get out. In other words, we need to replace him. He's not going to do it. He already knows this is unpopular, even with his own party. You have sanctuary cities saying, enough, we can't handle it. When a sanctuary city says, we want to send them to the country, you know there's a big problem. When the cities that have thought it was such a great idea, they had to deal with it, all of a sudden the realities hit them, they don't have a place to keep them. Then when you have nothing but consumers, nobody producing something, when they're consuming, whether it be food, shelter, they're not working, they're not legally allowed to work. Stay in Mexico was the right thing to do. And now we're literally having billion-dollar grants with no bidding process, providing people at a very expensive rate, more than you and I would go on a vacation with, for very meager accommodations with no hope of staying here in the long term because they're not here legally. And the only way for them to stay here will be through avoiding any sort of contact with the legal system because they're going to be deported if we follow the law.
Right.
And if we're not following the law, why are they here to begin with?
I mean, that's part of the humanitarian crisis. Of course, we've got the children that have just been lost, the tens of thousands of children that have been lost. We've got the drugs coming over. We've got the terrorists coming over. And you're right. I was on the border during the Trump administration's policy of remain in Mexico, and it looked like a ghost town. It was working back then. Congressman, we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining us. Great to see you. Appreciate your insight.
My pleasure. God bless you, and Semper Fidelis.
Semper Fi.